Picture this. It's 1977, and Second Officer Leonard Bishop is giving what he thinks is a routine tour of his ship to a soft-spoken passenger with a British accent. The man asks technical questions about safety procedures, examines the lifeboats with unusual intensity, and touches the ship's railings as if he's searching for something he's lost. When Bishop shows him a photograph of Captain Edward Smith years later, his blood runs cold. "I know that man," he whispers. "I gave him a tour of my boat." But here's the thing that will make your skin crawl. Captain Edward Smith died with the Titanic in 1912, 65 years before that tour ever took place. His body was never recovered. So, who was that man walking the decks, asking about safety procedures for a disaster he had already lived through? And more importantly, what was he really looking for? Before we dive into the abyss of this story, I need you to understand something. What you're about to hear isn't folklore or urban legend. These are documented accounts, investigated testimonies, real experiences that have been recorded by professionals, journalists, and countless witnesses across more than a century. The paranormal legacy of the Titanic is so extensive and so well documented that it challenges everything we think we know about death, consciousness, and the possibility that some tragedies are so profound they tear holes in reality itself. Subscribe to this channel now, because if you're someone who's ever wondered whether death is truly the end, what you're about to discover will change the way you think about the nature of existence forever. The story of the Titanic's haunted legacy begins in the suffocating darkness of a hotel room in Greenwich Village, New York City, where the air still carries the phantom scent of salt water and the metallic taste of fear that no amount of time seems able to wash away. The Jane Hotel stands today as it stood in April 1912, its red brick facade hiding secrets that seep through the walls like blood through bandages, its narrow corridors echoing with footsteps that belong to men who should have been buried at sea over a century ago. On April 19, 1912, 100 surviving crew members of the RMS Titanic gathered in the hotel's assembly hall, a room so small and cramped that their collective breath seemed to fog the air with the weight of their shared trauma. These were not the fortunate passengers who had been rescued and reunited with their families. These were the working men, the stokers and stewards and deckhands who had watched their shipmates disappear into the black water, who had heard the death cries of 1,500 souls as the greatest ship ever built broke apart like a child's toy in the hands of an indifferent universe. The memorial service they held that night was meant to honor their dead companions, but what they actually created was something far more powerful and far more dangerous than they could have imagined. As Miss Josephine Upham's fingers moved across the piano keys, and their broken voices rose in a chorus of "Nearer, my God, to Thee," they were unknowingly performing a ritual of binding, anchoring the souls of the dead to the physical world through the sheer intensity of their grief and guilt. The New York Times would describe their singing as a mighty, roaring chorus, but what the newspaper couldn't capture was the way the very air in that room seemed to thicken with an energy that had nothing to do with music and everything to do with a collective refusal to accept that their friends were truly gone. The hotel's current staff and guests report paranormal experiences that suggest those crew members never truly left. Visitors describe walking down the narrow hallways late at night and feeling invisible hands touch their shoulders in gestures of desperate comfort, as if the ghosts of traumatized sailors are still trying to console each other in their shared anguish. The building's elevators operate on their own, traveling between floors with no passengers, their brass buttons lighting up in sequences that seem to follow the ship's original deck layout, as if phantom crew members are still reporting for duty shifts that ended over a century ago. But the most chilling reports come from guests who have stayed in the hotel's tiny rooms, spaces that measure only 7 feet by 7 feet, and contain bunk beds that mirror the ship's original berths with uncanny accuracy. These visitors describe lying awake in the darkness, listening to the sound of water dripping somewhere within the walls, feeling the room grow progressively colder until their breath becomes visible in the air, and hearing what sounds like Morse code being tapped out against the metal bed frames. The rhythm is always the same, always the international distress signal, always transmitted with the same desperate urgency that characterized Jack Phillips' final moments in the Titanic's wireless room. Would you be able to sleep in one of those rooms, knowing that you're lying in the same position as men who died in terror and despair? Would you be able to close your eyes in a space that has been soaked in trauma for over a century, where the very geometry of the room seems designed to recreate the claustrophobic horror of being trapped on a sinking ship? These aren't comfortable questions to contemplate, but they force us to confront the possibility that some places become so saturated with human suffering that they function as permanent doorways between the world of the living and the realm of the dead. The paranormal activity extends far beyond the confines of the Jane Hotel, reaching across oceans and decades like spectral tentacles that refuse to release their grip on our reality. In museums and exhibitions around the world where Titanic artifacts are displayed, staff members and visitors report experiences that challenge our fundamental understanding of how consciousness relates to physical objects. At the Luxor Hotel in Las Vegas, employees working the night shift in the Titanic artifact exhibition describe encountering a woman in a black period dress with a white collar, her hair arranged in the Gibson girl style popular among first-class passengers in 1912. This apparition doesn't simply appear and disappear like a traditional ghost sighting. She walks down the exhibition's replica of the grand staircase with purpose and intention, moving as if she has somewhere specific to go, someone particular to find. When a photographer preparing for the exhibition's opening spotted her and offered to take her picture, assuming she was part of the display, she ignored him completely. But when he turned back to his equipment, she was suddenly standing directly behind him, close enough that he should have felt her breath on his neck, close enough that he should have heard the rustle of her dress. When he offered again to photograph her, she didn't simply ignore him this time. She vanished, dissolving into the air like mist, leaving behind only the lingering scent of expensive perfume and something else. Something that smelled like deep ocean water and metal that has been submerged for too long. The artifacts themselves seem to carry within them an energy that defies scientific explanation, as if the intense emotions experienced by their original owners in those final moments have somehow imprinted themselves onto the molecular structure of the objects. At the Georgia Aquarium's Titanic exhibition, paranormal investigators have captured electronic voice phenomena recordings of what appears to be a male voice saying, "No, please wait," in the recreated iceberg room. The exact words that countless passengers might have spoken as they realized their fate was sealed. Staff members report being touched by invisible hands, feeling pressure on the tops of their heads as if someone is trying to get their attention, and witnessing shadows that move independently of any light source. Joe Zimmer, the general manager of Titanic, the experience in Orlando has become something of an unwilling medium for these supernatural encounters. He reports having his name called by voices that seem to come from empty rooms, feeling invisible hands tug at his clothing and hair, and hearing the sound of a phantom orchestra playing period music late at night when the exhibition is closed and empty. But perhaps most disturbing is his account of a heavy chain in one of the displays that swings on its own, moving only when staff members discuss the paranormal activity, as if it's responding to their conversations about the dead. The phenomenon extends to photographic evidence that cannot be easily dismissed or explained away. At the Titanic Museum in Branson, Missouri, security cameras have captured footage of a fully decorated Christmas tree being violently knocked over in an empty room, the ornaments scattering across the floor as if struck by an invisible force of considerable power. The incident occurred at 5:56 p.m. on a winter evening, when no staff members were present in that section of the museum, and the surveillance footage shows no visible cause for the tree's sudden collapse. Staff members at the Branson Museum have developed an almost casual familiarity with what they describe as shadow figures that move through the exhibits with purpose and intelligence, full-bodied apparitions that vanish the instant they're directly observed but can be glimpsed in peripheral vision, moving between displays with the deliberate gait of people who know exactly where they're going. Jamie Terrell, who has worked at the museum for 17 years, describes seeing these figures so frequently that she no longer considers it unusual. "I've seen them," she says matter-of-factly. "Quick as I can snap my fingers, they're gone. And it happens so many times. It's not a coincidence for me. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of these museum hauntings is the way they seem to center around specific artifacts, as if the spirits of the dead are drawn to objects they once owned or touched in life. Wedding rings display cases experience unexplained temperature drops. Children's toys move slightly when no one is watching, and a pocket watch recovered from the body of a passenger has been observed to tick for brief periods despite having no functional mechanism after more than a century underwater. The implication is both profound and terrifying, that our consciousness, our very essence, can become so strongly attached to physical objects that it survives the destruction of our bodies and continues to exist in a state that we can barely comprehend. The question this raises is one that should keep you awake at night. If consciousness can attach itself to objects, if the trauma of death can create electromagnetic imprints that persist across decades, what does this tell us about the nature of reality itself? Are we living in a universe where nothing is ever truly lost, where every moment of human suffering and joy leaves a permanent mark on the fabric of existence? And if so, what other tragedies might be echoing through our world in ways we haven't yet learned to detect? The paranormal legacy of the Titanic extends even into the realm of modern technology, in ways that challenge our understanding of how electromagnetic energy behaves across time. In 1936, 24 years after the disaster, Gordon Cosgrave was operating his ham radio equipment from his home in South London when he began receiving what he initially thought were delayed atmospheric echoes. But as he listened more carefully, transcribing the Morse code signals with growing unease, he realized he was hearing something that should have been scientifically impossible: actual radio transmissions from the night of the Titanic disaster, played back with perfect accuracy 24 years after they were originally sent. The messages he received were not garbled or corrupted like you might expect from some kind of atmospheric anomaly. They were crystal-clear communications containing specific technical details about the disaster that perfectly matched the historical record descriptions of 16 lifeboats being launched, reports of steam being blown off from the boilers to prevent explosion, updates on the ship's increasingly desperate situation as water flooded the lower decks. When editors from a wireless journal visited Cosgrave's home to investigate his claims, they sat with him in his cramped radio room, surrounded by the warm glow of vacuum tubes and the constant hum of electrical equipment, listening to static and atmospheric interference until suddenly, without warning, Cosgrave handed one of them his headphones. The editor put on the headphones and found himself listening to what purported to be a transmission from the Titanic itself. Last distress rockets fired. Steam blown off to prevent explosion. The voice transmitting the message carried the clipped, professional tone of a wireless operator trained in emergency procedures, but underneath that professionalism was an unmistakable note of rising panic. The sound of a man who knew he was about to die but was determined to keep transmitting until the very end. The journalist heard 2 more such messages on successive weekends, always late at night, always with the same heart-stopping authenticity that suggested he was somehow eavesdropping on the final moments of men who had been dead for nearly a quarter of a century. How do we explain this phenomenon? How do we account for electromagnetic signals that carry not just technical information, but emotional resonance, messages that seem to pulse with the same desperate hope and crushing despair that characterized their original transmission? Science offers no adequate framework for understanding how radio waves could somehow preserve not just data, but the very consciousness of the men who sent them. Yet the evidence suggests exactly that the trauma of the Titanic disaster was so intense it created a kind of electromagnetic ghost, a signal that continues to transmit across time as if Jack Phillips is still sitting at his brass telegraph keys, still believing that if he just keeps sending that signal, someone will finally come to save them all. This brings us to perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Titanic's paranormal legacy: the reports from the wreck site itself, that desolate stretch of ocean floor where the ship's broken hull rests in eternal darkness. Ships passing over the coordinates where the Titanic lies have reported seeing orbs of light rising from the depths, glowing spheres that appear to dance just beneath the surface of the water, in patterns that suggest intelligence and intention rather than random natural phenomena. These lights have been witnessed by multiple vessels over decades, always in the same location, always exhibiting the same purposeful movement that defies explanation through conventional maritime phenomena. Submarines equipped with sophisticated sonar and communication equipment report picking up signals from the wreck site that match the frequency and pattern of 1912-era wireless transmissions, SOS, calls that pulse through the water with the same rhythm that Jack Phillips transmitted in his final moments. But here's what makes these reports truly chilling. The signals aren't just random repetitions of historical transmissions. They seem to respond to the presence of modern vessels, growing stronger when ships approach the wreck site and fading as they move away, as if the consciousness trapped in that underwater tomb is still trying to flag down passing ships, still hoping for rescue that will never come. Think about the implications of this for a moment. Consider what it means if consciousness can survive the destruction of the physical body and continue to exist in a state that retains memory, purpose, and the ability to interact with the electromagnetic spectrum. If the dead can still communicate, if they can still hope, if they can still suffer, then death is not the peaceful release from earthly concerns that we've been taught to believe it is. Instead, it becomes a transition into a state of existence where the traumatized consciousness remains trapped in the moment of its destruction, endlessly reliving the horror of its final moments while desperately trying to reach out to a world that has moved on without them. This concept becomes even more horrifying when we consider the specific nature of the Titanic disaster. These weren't quick deaths, these weren't painless passings into the unknown. The passengers and crew of the Titanic experienced prolonged terror as they slowly realized their situation was hopeless, as they watched the ship's lights go out one by one, as they felt the deck tilting beneath their feet at impossible angles, while the sound of metal tearing and people screaming filled the night air like a chorus from hell itself. Many froze to death in the -27-degree water, their bodies going numb while their minds remained painfully aware of what was happening to them. Others suffered broken necks from defective life belts, dying slowly and in agony, while floating in water so cold it felt like liquid fire against their skin. If trauma of this magnitude can indeed imprint itself onto physical reality, if consciousness can persist beyond bodily death when the circumstances of that death are sufficiently horrific, then the Titanic represents something far more sinister than a historical tragedy. It becomes a wound in the fabric of reality itself, a place where the boundary between life and death has been permanently damaged by the sheer intensity of human suffering. And this wound continues to bleed, continues to affect our world in ways that we're only beginning to understand. The most recent manifestation of this phenomenon occurred in June 2023, when the OceanGate submersible Titan imploded while descending to visit the Titanic wreck, killing all 5 people aboard in an instant of catastrophic pressure failure. The victim's final communication was sent at 3,341 meters depth. Dropped 2 WTs, referring to drop weights, transmitted just 7 seconds before the vessel was crushed like an egg in a hydraulic press. But here's what makes this modern tragedy particularly chilling in the context of the Titanic's paranormal legacy. Within hours of the Titan's destruction, ships in the area began reporting the same electromagnetic anomalies that have been associated with the Titanic site for over a century, as if the new deaths had somehow amplified the existing paranormal activity. Could it be that the Titanic site has become what paranormal investigators call a thin place, a location where the barrier between dimensions has been worn so thin by repeated trauma that consciousness can slip through more easily? Could it be that each new death in those waters adds to the accumulated psychic energy, creating a kind of supernatural feedback loop that grows stronger with each passing tragedy? The idea is as fascinating as it is terrifying, suggesting that some locations become so saturated with human suffering that they function as permanent gateways between the world of the living and whatever lies beyond. The hauntings associated with Captain Edward Smith himself present perhaps the most compelling evidence for consciousness surviving death and remaining tethered to unfinished business in the physical world. Smith's spirit has been reported in multiple locations across different continents, always appearing with the same sense of purpose that characterized his living persona, always seeming to be conducting some kind of inspection or assessment of maritime safety. His childhood home in Stoke-on-Trent, England, has become notorious among paranormal investigators for the frequency and intensity of his appearances there. Neil and Louise Bonner, who purchased Smith's childhood home knowing of its historical significance, have rented the property to multiple tenants over the years, and nearly all of them have reported similar experiences. The sensation of being watched by an invisible presence, unexplainable cold spots that appear suddenly and feel as cold as an iceberg, according to one tenant, and full-bodied apparitions of a man in naval uniform who appears when the house is empty and quiet. One tenant described waking in the middle of the night to find a figure standing at the foot of his bed, a man whose eyes held depths that spoke of having witnessed unimaginable tragedy, who stared at him with an expression of profound sadness before slowly fading away like morning mist. But Smith's appearances aren't limited to his childhood home. In Southampton, England, the city from which the Titanic departed on its maiden voyage, his widow Eleanor reported seeing him in their home on the very night the ship sank, hours before news of the disaster reached England. She described watching him walk to the window and look out at the garden with an expression of infinite sadness, his form clearly visible, but somehow not quite solid, as if he were projected from somewhere very far away. He neither looked at her nor spoke to her, and when he reached the window, he simply vanished, leaving behind only the lingering scent of sea air and tobacco that she always associated with his presence. Eleanor Smith knew her husband was dead from the moment she saw his ghost, understood with the terrible certainty that sometimes comes with supernatural encounters that she would never see him alive again. She wasn't the only woman in Southampton to experience such visitations that night. All across the city, wives of sailors and crew members reported waking from nightmares, hearing their names called by familiar voices, feeling the presence of loved ones who were, unknown to them, dying in the freezing Atlantic waters hundreds of miles away. It was as if the intensity of their men's final thoughts, their desperate desire to say goodbye, had somehow bridged the impossible distance between life and death, allowing their consciousness to reach across space and time to touch the people they loved one last time. The pattern repeats itself in locations around the world where Titanic artifacts are housed or where the ship's memory is preserved. At the Adelphi Hotel in Liverpool, which contains an exact replica of the Titanic's first-class smoking room, paranormal investigators have reported seeing 3 men in naval uniforms standing at the far end of the room, their forms translucent but unmistakably present, their posture suggesting they are engaged in serious discussion about matters of life and death. The investigators believe these figures are Captain Smith and 2 of his officers, still conferring about the disaster that claimed their lives, still trying to understand how their unsinkable ship could have been destroyed by something as simple as ice and water. At a Belfast pub filled with Titanic memorabilia, a couple named Cheryl and Luke Arkless discovered something that challenged their understanding of reality when they looked at photographs taken during their evening out. In one image, everything around them was crystal clear, except for a blurry figure in the background that seemed to be watching the band perform. They remembered feeling a cold wind against their backs during the photo session but had attributed it to poor ventilation in the old building. It wasn't until they returned home and examined the photographs more carefully that they realized the blurred figure bore an unmistakable resemblance to Captain Smith, as if his spirit had been drawn to the music and camaraderie that reminded him of the Titanic's final hours when the ship's band played until the very end. Would you want to look at that photograph? Would you want to see evidence that the dead can intrude upon the moments of joy and celebration of the living, appearing in our pictures like uninvited guests at a party they were never meant to attend? The image forces us to confront the possibility that we are never truly alone, that the consciousness of those who have died traumatic deaths might be constantly present around us, invisible observers of our daily lives who occasionally manage to make themselves known through technology that captures more than we intended it to. The phenomenon reaches its most disturbing manifestation in what paranormal investigators have identified as the Phantom Orchestra phenomenon. Multiple witnesses at different Titanic exhibitions have reported hearing period music being played late at night, when the buildings are empty and locked, the sound seeming to emanate from the exhibits themselves rather than any external source. The music is always from the 1910s era, always performed with the kind of professional precision that characterized the Titanic's 8-member band, and always accompanied by an atmosphere of such profound sadness that witnesses describe feeling overwhelmed by grief that isn't their own. Wallace Hartley and his 7 fellow musicians continued playing as the ship sank, their music serving as a soundtrack to humanity's darkest hour as they stood on the tilting deck while chaos reigned around them. They played not because they believed the music would save anyone, but because they understood that in the face of absolute horror, the only response that preserves human dignity is to continue doing what you do best, to maintain your professional standards even as the world ends around you. Their final song, according to survivors, was "Nearer, My God, to Thee," a hymn that speaks of finding peace through proximity to the divine even in the midst of suffering. But what if their music didn't end when they died? What if the intensity of their final performance, the pure human courage displayed in their decision to keep playing while death approached, somehow imprinted itself onto the electromagnetic spectrum in the same way that Jack Phillips's SOS signals continue to transmit? The Phantom Orchestra phenomenon suggests exactly that consciousness, when focused with sufficient intensity on a particular purpose, can create a kind of psychic recording that continues to play long after the performers have left the stage. This raises profound questions about the nature of consciousness itself and its relationship to physical reality. If our thoughts and emotions can somehow embed themselves in electromagnetic fields, if our final moments can create imprints that persist across centuries, what does this tell us about what we really are? Are we merely biological machines that cease to function at death? Or are we something more complex, something that can transcend the destruction of our physical forms under certain circumstances? The Titanic's paranormal legacy suggests the latter, and the implications are both exhilarating and absolutely terrifying. Consider for a moment what it means that multiple independent witnesses across different decades and continents have reported virtually identical experiences with these Titanic-related hauntings. These aren't stories that have been influenced by popular culture or shared mythology. Many of the witnesses had little knowledge of the Titanic disaster before their encounters, and their descriptions often contain technical details about the ship and its final moments that they couldn't have known without extensive research. Yet, they consistently report the same types of phenomena, the same electromagnetic anomalies, the same apparitions wearing period-appropriate clothing, the same emotional atmosphere of profound grief and unfinished business. The consistency of these reports across time and space suggests that we're dealing with something far more substantial than shared delusion or wishful thinking. We're confronting evidence for a reality that most of us would prefer not to believe in. A reality where consciousness can persist beyond death, where traumatic experiences can create permanent alterations in the fabric of space and time, where some places become so saturated with human suffering that they function as bridges between dimensions. And if this is true for the Titanic, what other tragedies might have left similar marks on our world? What other disasters might have created thin places where the dead continue to walk among us? The most recent investigations into Titanic-related paranormal activity have employed sophisticated electromagnetic detection equipment, infrared cameras, and digital audio recording devices that eliminate many of the traditional explanations for supernatural phenomena. Yet these modern tools continue to document anomalies that cannot be explained through conventional scientific understanding. Temperature measurements show localized cold spots that appear suddenly in artifact displays, sometimes dropping 30 degrees in a matter of seconds, with no identifiable heat source or air circulation pattern that could account for such dramatic changes. Electronic voice phenomena recordings capture whispered conversations in multiple languages, always in accents and dialects consistent with the Titanic's International Passenger Manifest, always containing emotional content that speaks of loss, confusion, and desperate attempts to communicate with loved ones. Digital cameras record orbs of light that move with apparent intelligence through exhibition spaces, following specific paths that correspond to the ship's original layout, as if invisible passengers are still walking the decks of a vessel that exists now only in memory and electromagnetic echo. But here's what makes these modern investigations truly disturbing. The equipment doesn't just record random paranormal activity. It documents responses to direct communication attempts, as if the consciousness trapped in these locations retains the ability to understand and react to questions from the living. When investigators ask specific questions about the disaster, the electromagnetic readings change in patterns that suggest intelligent response. When they request that spirits make their presence known, cold spots appear on command. When they ask the dead to interact with specific objects, those objects begin to exhibit anomalous behavior that defies mechanical explanation. This interactive element transforms these locations from mere haunted sites into something approaching communication portals with the dead, places where the boundary between dimensions has been worn so thin that conscious interaction between the living and the deceased becomes possible. And this possibility opens up questions that challenge everything we think we know about the nature of existence itself. If the dead can hear us, if they can respond to our questions, if they can manipulate physical objects and electromagnetic fields, then what are they trying to tell us? What message are they so desperate to communicate that they continue reaching out across the impossible gulf of death? The answer may lie in understanding the specific psychological state of the Titanic's victims during their final moments. Unlike victims of sudden disasters who die instantly without time to process what's happening to them, the passengers and crew of the Titanic experienced what psychologists would recognize as prolonged anticipatory grief. They had hours to understand that they were going to die, hours to think about the people they would never see again, hours to contemplate all the things they would never be able to say or do. This extended period of conscious awareness during the dying process may have created optimal conditions for consciousness to detach from the physical body while remaining coherent and purposeful. Think about those final hours from the perspective of someone trapped on that ship. Imagine standing on the deck as the Titanic listed at increasingly severe angles, feeling the vibrations through the metal as the ship's structure began to fail, hearing the sound of furniture sliding across floors below deck and the distant screams of people trapped in flooding compartments. Imagine the terrible clarity that would come with the realization that rescue was impossible, that no amount of hoping or praying would change the fundamental reality of your situation. Imagine having time to think about every person you loved, every dream you would never fulfill, every word you wished you had spoken but never would. That kind of concentrated emotional intensity, focused through the lens of imminent death and compressed into a few hours of absolute terror, creates psychological conditions that may be uniquely conducive to consciousness persisting beyond bodily death. The victims of the Titanic didn't just die, they died while experiencing the most intense emotional states human beings are capable of feeling, and that intensity may have been sufficient to burn their consciousness into the fabric of reality itself like a brand pressed into flesh. They became ghosts not because they chose to, but because the circumstances of their death were so extreme that their consciousness couldn't disengage cleanly from the physical world. This theory gains additional credibility when we consider that not all Titanic-related hauntings involve random manifestations of paranormal activity. Many of the reported encounters suggest purposeful behavior on the part of the spirits, as if they retain specific goals or missions that they are trying to complete. Captain Smith's appearances consistently involve inspections of maritime safety equipment, suggesting that his consciousness remains focused on preventing similar disasters. The crew members haunting the Jane Hotel seem to be seeking comfort and companionship from each other, recreating the bonds of fellowship that sustained them during their ordeal. Jack Phillips continues transmitting his SOS signal as if he still believes rescue is possible if he just keeps trying. These aren't the random, chaotic manifestations we might expect from disembodied consciousness drifting aimlessly in some kind of afterlife limbo. These are focused, intentional activities that suggest the spirits of the Titanic's victims retain their personalities, their memories, and their sense of duty even after death. They remain who they were in life, but trapped in a state of existence where they cannot move forward, cannot find peace, cannot accept that their earthly responsibilities have ended. And this raises perhaps the most disturbing question of all. If death doesn't release us from our psychological patterns and emotional attachments, if we remain essentially ourselves but in a state where we cannot affect meaningful change in the world, then what kind of existence awaits us after our own deaths? The implications become even more frightening when we consider that the Titanic disaster occurred more than a century ago, yet the paranormal activity shows no signs of diminishing. If anything, modern investigations suggest that the hauntings are becoming more intense and more interactive as time passes, as if the trapped consciousness is growing stronger rather than weaker with the passage of decades. This suggests that whatever state of existence these spirits occupy, it is not temporary. They are not working through their trauma and moving on to some better place. They are stuck, permanently locked in a state of unfinished business and unresolved anguish. And if this can happen to the victims of one disaster, how many other tragic events might have created similar supernatural wounds in the fabric of reality? How many battlefields might still echo with the consciousness of soldiers who died in terror and confusion? How many hospitals might house the spirits of patients who passed away while experiencing intense fear or regret? How many accident sites might be haunted by victims whose final moments were filled with thoughts of loved ones they would never see again? The Titanic's paranormal legacy may not be unique. It may simply be the most well-documented example of a phenomenon that occurs whenever death comes with sufficient trauma and emotional intensity. This possibility transforms our understanding of death from a natural transition into the unknown, into something far more complex and potentially terrifying. Death becomes not an ending, but a transformation into a state of existence that may be characterized by eternal consciousness, without the ability to meaningfully interact with the physical world. Eternal awareness without the possibility of growth or change. Eternal memory without the blessing of forgetfulness. The spirits of the Titanic may be showing us our own potential future, a glimpse into what awaits us if we die under circumstances that create sufficient psychological trauma to prevent our consciousness from detaching cleanly from earthly concerns. The modern world, with its constant stimulation and endless distractions, rarely allows us to contemplate the reality of our own mortality with the kind of focused attention these questions deserve. We live as if death were something that happens to other people, something we can avoid thinking about until it becomes unavoidable. But the Titanic's haunted legacy forces us to confront the possibility that death is not the peaceful transition we hope it will be. That consciousness may persist beyond bodily death in forms we are not prepared to imagine. That some kinds of dying create conditions where the soul becomes trapped between worlds indefinitely. Would you want to know, as you face your own inevitable death, whether you will simply cease to exist, or whether some part of your consciousness will persist in a state of eternal awareness? Would you want to understand the specific psychological and emotional conditions that might trap your spirit in a liminal state between life and death? These aren't comfortable questions to ask, but they are questions that the Titanic's paranormal legacy makes unavoidable. The evidence suggests that consciousness can indeed survive bodily death, but the form that survival takes may be far more complex and potentially disturbing than our traditional religious and philosophical frameworks have prepared us to understand. The final question that emerges from our exploration of the Titanic's haunted legacy is perhaps the most important one of all. What responsibility do the living have to the dead who cannot find peace? If the spirits of the Titanic's victims are indeed trapped in a state of eternal, unfinished business, reaching out to us through electromagnetic anomalies and paranormal manifestations, what are they asking of us? Are they seeking acknowledgement, understanding, or something more concrete? Do they want us to learn from their tragedy so that similar disasters can be prevented? Do they want us to remember them not just as historical footnotes, but as individuals who experienced real fear, real love, and real loss in their final moments? The continuing reports of paranormal activity associated with the Titanic suggest that these questions remain unanswered, that whatever message the dead are trying to communicate to the living has not yet been successfully received. Their electromagnetic echoes continue to pulse through our technology. Their apparitions continue to walk through our museums and hotels. Their consciousness continues to reach across the impossible gulf of death because something remains unfinished. Something demands resolution. Until we understand what they need from us, until we learn to listen to what they are trying to tell us, they may remain trapped forever in that liminal space between worlds, eternal witnesses to humanity's greatest maritime disaster. The story of the Titanic's haunted legacy ultimately serves as a mirror reflecting our own deepest fears about mortality, consciousness, and the possibility that death may not provide the release from earthly suffering that we desperately hope it will. It challenges us to consider that the universe may be far stranger and far more interconnected than our scientific understanding currently allows, that consciousness may be more fundamental and more persistent than we have dared to imagine, and that some tragedies create wounds in reality itself that never fully heal. As you lie in bed tonight, listening to the sounds of your house settling around you, feeling the familiar comfort of your warm blankets and solid walls. Remember that beneath the surface of our everyday reality, there may be layers of existence we barely understand, populated by consciousness that has persisted beyond death in forms we are not equipped to comprehend. The next time you hear unexplained sounds in the darkness, the next time you feel watched by invisible eyes, the next time you encounter technology that behaves in ways it shouldn't, consider the possibility that you are witnessing evidence of the same phenomenon that has kept the spirits of the Titanic reaching out to us for more than a century. The evidence we've explored tonight suggests that the boundary between life and death may be far more permeable than we ever imagined. That consciousness can indeed survive the destruction of the physical body under certain extreme circumstances, and that some places become so saturated with human trauma that they function as permanent doorways between dimensions. If you found this exploration as fascinating and disturbing as I did, then you're exactly the kind of person I want in this community. Subscribe to this channel now, not just because you enjoy scary stories, but because you're someone who isn't afraid to confront the deepest questions about the nature of reality itself. I want to hear from you in the comments below. Have you ever had an experience that you couldn't explain through conventional means? Have you ever felt the presence of someone who wasn't physically there? Have you ever encountered technology that seemed to respond to invisible influences? Your stories matter because they help us build a more complete picture of how consciousness might persist beyond death, and they remind us that we are not alone in questioning the fundamental assumptions about reality that most people take for granted. If this video opened your mind to new possibilities about the nature of existence, if it made you think differently about death and consciousness, if it gave you chills that you'll still be feeling hours from now, then hit that like button and share it with someone who isn't afraid to explore the shadows where science meets the supernatural. Together, we can continue investigating the mysteries that conventional academia prefers to ignore, the questions that might just reveal that reality is far stranger and far more wonderful than we ever dared to believe.